Come back to the second day of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change 5. This is the second session of the day. We will have two presentations rather than three because one of our presenters, Corinne Lajoie, is unable to present today due to a medical emergency. We have decided that we will Agnès will present, and will be followed, her presentation will be followed by a roughly 15-minute question period, and then we will have C's presentation and have a Q&A of approximately 15 minutes for C's devoted to C's presentation, and then maybe we'll have a bit of time to do a group sort of Q&A, and perhaps we will finish early for the day. Okay, so let me introduce Agnès. Agnès Berthelot-Raffard is a political philosopher and an associate professor of critical disability studies at the School of Public Health, at the School of Health Policy and Management at York University in Toronto, Canada, where she held the first Canadian position in Black disability studies. Agnès recently published From Capacitalism to Disability Justice in Academia, a philosophical manifesto, and it was published in the Journal of Equity in Education and Society. Welcome, Agnès. Begin whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be here with talking to disability in philosophy, which is really rare, I can say. So it's a pleasure. So I will share my screen. It will be easier. In fact, I will present the work that I done in the chapter that you just talking about. It's a chapter regarding disability justice in academia, how we could integrate disability in academia, and I developed a new concept in that. So, as you know, the university core mission is typically to educate individuals capable of reasoning and contributing fully to society. And Canadian University in particular has been designed to accommodate physically and intellectually able individuals, providing a space where they may enhance their intellectual capacities and exercise their rationality. In this context, of course, disabled students has been viewing as incompatible with the requirement of higher education. But in Canada and elsewhere in the world now, there is initiative targeting equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also decolonization within university setting to improve accessibility. So for example, they gave exam period accommodation and things like that. But people living with temporary and permanent disability continue to be deeming unfit for higher education, and they continue to encounter barriers to receiving appropriate accommodations. We support their specific beliefs in their journey to success, and we know from many research that has been done that there is really a difficulty particularly for students who are racialized or who are non-gender conforming. So ableism and disableism are rooted in Canadian university. So disabled students and university employees experience multiple barriers and may be discouraged for disclosing their situation. So these barriers are multiple in fact. There is a lack of understanding and recognizing their own support need, the fact that they are unaware of what accommodations are available to them. They could also struggle to understand and follow the requirement processes to seeking appropriate accommodation, which could allow them to fully embrace their professional and educational responsibility. As a result, we can postulate that disability disclosure among university employees may be lower than the actual number of self-identified disabled employees within academia. So, moreover, rather than being seen as people to whom the university provide opportunities for independent learning and growth, disabled individuals are more often seen as research subjects in the field of health, social science, and humanities. So importantly, their disablement. So in fact, when I said that there is a problem to recognize them, so the disablement of many people has been in some ways orchestrated within academia for two major reasons. First of all, this setting is mostly based on recognizing intellectual capacities. Second, because of the fact that universities play a specific role in the development of the theory and practices of eugenics. Many pseudo-scientific ideas, such as the one in the medical model of disability, that support the categories of gender and race, difference as madness, gained their legitimacy because they were developed in the university setting. So nowadays, there is more research done with and by the disabled, since disability studies are a specific field of teaching on research, but a marginalized one. Nevertheless, most of the time, studies on disability do not necessarily try to understand what the experience of living with a disability is exactly. So there is consequently a pressing need to exist to improve our understanding of how to support disabled individuals within academia, including neurodivergent people whose disability may be less obvious. That raises questions about the genuine commitment of Canadian universities to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So today, what I would like to do is explore whether Canadian universities prioritize accessibility for disabled individuals, particularly when the disability intersect with other identity factors, such as their race and gender. So my initial analysis focused on my innovative concept of racial ableism in order to address the significant problem preventing people with disabilities from being recognized as knowledge seeker and knowledge producer in academia. So I will examine the relationship between universities and knowledge, which is, in my opinion, fell under the radar. And just to mention that I believe, for example, in philosophy, we are talking a lot about neurodivergence because of also our conception of knowledge. So I will examine this really important relationship. Why it may seem apparent that knowledge is imparted and created at universities, we must challenge our shared understanding of how knowledge is defined and how it functions in order to see how the university might introduce novel approaches to learning and research. So I posit that the obstacles encountered by disabled students in a university environment are rooted in limited conceptions of knowledge and the prevailing norms of knowledge creation, which are influenced by colonial perspectives. So I illustrate that this colonial influence is closely linked to racial ableism, a term that I coined in the paper that Shelley mentioned. This paper emphasizes this concept emphasizes the interconnectedness of capitalism, colonialism, race, and ableism. So I will just say that in my view, I think that ableism is deeply articulated with a capitalist mindset, and I will not have time to discuss that today, and I will just focus on the notion of knowledge. So to work towards an anti-ableist utopia in high-quality educational system based on pluriversal design, so the idea that there is more than one way to understand the world and produce knowledge about it, we must genuinely challenge the prevailing view of knowledge and cognitive capacity. In particular, an ethic of academia is necessary to grasp why a specific understanding of knowledge is object and the way in which they are studied and transmitted reinforce ableism. Indeed, because of a limited conception of knowledge and what is needed to produce knowledge, the academic world tends to limit the epistemic agency of people living with disabilities. This limited conception needs to be challenged in order to get the roots of academic ableism. To see the connection between the representation of knowledge and the lack of acknowledgement of the epistemic agency of people living with disability as an explanation for ableist discrimination in academia, there must be a deeper discussion about the nature of the knowledge and the skill necessary for generating theory and methodologies in various fields. So the social and epistemological foundation of both knowledge and the university itself are fundamentally ableist. So the problem, in fact, what I want to say is that, of course, knowledge, we know is, in philosophy, it's defined in many, many ways. But what I want to say is that we tend to defend knowledge as something that refers to information, subject, theories, and method in a general or specific field, which can be communicated, processed, and understood using language and reasoning. But this definition, unfortunately, excludes individuals with cognitive disabilities. So we tend to follow a definition of knowledge as propositional only, and that apply only to people that can exercise their rationality. Propositional knowledge is highly neuronormative, and it's something developed in the research done by Amandine Catala in particular, and Luc Fauché, considering that it may also include neurodivergent individuals. They may be excluded if they are perceived are incapable of functioning within the limitation of a neurotypical reasoning. So this emphasis on rationality is due to a propositional view of knowledge that Shotwell developed, which may limit the possibility of acknowledging the epistemic agency of neurodivergent individuals or people living with cognitive disability. Indeed, if we value a propositional knowledge, we fail to acknowledge embodied and affected kinds of knowledge, which are not only essential in fields such as dance, theater, field studies, but also in other fields such as psychology, women and gender study, medicine, for example. So the narrow view of knowledge is logocentric and denies the profound value of the three forms of implicit understanding, so the practical skill-based knowledge, as well as somatic and bodily knowing. So we can also refer to the research of Ben Spatz in theater creation. The last two forms of implicit understanding are often wholly dismissed in the academic environment, even though they are relevant for people living with disability, as kinds of knowledge through which they experience themselves and better understand their need. Dismissing knowledge that takes the form of implicit understanding in academia is similar to deny the epistemic agency of people living with disability. Consequently, it's really important to bring finally a new understanding of knowledge and see how it's intertwined with an ethical examination of what epistemic agency means and how we might promote an epistemic agency that is more inclusive and respectful of all individuals, regardless of their cognitive and physical abilities. Since the idea of university is based on a propositional conception of knowledge, this requirement implies challenging its exclusionary logocentrism in order to rethink higher education and make it setting inclusive for people living with a disability. In fact, this propositional conception of knowledge, it's led us to redefine what I call an intellectual contract, because this propositional conception of knowledge stems from the coloniality of knowledge that the colonial thinker demonstrate. And that stems for me from the notion of racial ableism. So, and what I would like to say regarding this notion in particular, because I don't know how many time I have and if I have still on time. But what I want to say is that it's related to the way in which, in fact, we understand. In fact, I refer to racial ableism as the way in which, as the way in which we reconstruct, yesterday we talked about intellectual test. An intellectual test was based on the dismissing of intelligence for some people because they are meant to do work in an industry, and in particular, they are meant to be physically able, but they cannot be intellectually able. So, in fact, there is a racial dimension of knowledge, because we are the racialized body are dismissed as intellectual and as knowledge seeker and knowledge production. So this understanding, if we take a stance of discrete theory or critical race theory in disability, we could understand how people who are living with disability has been constructed under an intellectual contract that tends to perceive human being as white, masculine, able-bodied, able-minded, racialized in a racial and patriarchal society structured by the intersection of race and ability. An individual ability or disability are sometimes determined by their racial identity. So the intellectual contract under which our Western society are constructed stereotype racialized bodies, excluding them from and deny their agency as knowledge seeker and producer. It's also stereotype disabled people, whether they are a physical, cognitive, and sensory impairment, as incapable of exercising their epistemic agency. So race and ability can impact the capacity of an individual to excel or struggle in their academic pursuit. So the denial of disabled people epistemic agency reflects the deep-seated inequality that persists in society, operative under racial hierarchies and ableism. So if we need to understand the roots of knowledge and how knowledge is disseminated and understood in academia, we may take a discrete perspective, a critical race theory in disability, to grasp why particular student bodies are denied identities as knowledge producer and seeker, and the way in which universities construct the idea of sub-person in their assumption that disabled students are unable to function normally due to perceived defect or deficit. So race is a disablement process. But on the dismissal of racialized people and disabled people as potential knowledge seeker and producer is related to this colonial roots of knowledge. And it's something in the North American mission, in fact, because they construct knowledge in a way that, they construct knowledge in a way that could exclude people. So I will, so as I said, it's linked to the roots of coloniality of knowledge. And I don't know, I little bit lost. I don't know if I have enough time to develop or if I should stop.
Agnès, this is Shelley. I think you can take maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shelley, for that, for this information. So on because that allow me to explain what I am talking about, what I am thinking. In fact, North American University, in particular in Canada, they are being more liberal and secular, but they promote and reproduce a coloniality of knowledge, which derives from the coloniality of power as demonstrated by colonial thinker, decolonial thinker. So Eurocentrism prioritizes a European way of producing knowledge. So when we look at coloniality of knowledge, we could understand the way in which North American University focus on colonial science, and it's something that also Jed Dolmage, that work on academic ableism, demonstrate in his book. So, and we must contextualize that within the framework of coloniality of knowledge as defined by Crorano. So that concept of coloniality of knowledge posits that there is an hegemony of a Eurocentric cultural system and a devaluation that devalue and even kill the knowledge produced by marginalized groups such as African, Afro-descent, indigenous people, and other racialized communities, but also the knowledge of disabled people that exclude knowledge of groups that deviate from the norms. So that implicitly this coloniality of knowledge recognize that there is a racial contract that is built upon and construct on what I call an intellectual contract, which racialize disabled people and disabled racialized people, rendering race and disability two criteria that disqualify people from attaining the status of human being. So I postulate a consubstantiality of race and ability, and the way they work together is linked is what I call racial ableism, a term that I conceptualize to express this continuity between the historical dehumanization of Black people, indigenous people, and people who are also, the continuity with the people they are alleged as having a cognitive disability. I will stop there for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Agnès. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So please put your questions for Agnès in the Q&A. I don't see anything there right now. Do we have any hands from panelists? Jonathan, you might have a question. Okay, well, actually, I'd like to pick up on what you ended with, because I find your notion of of racial ableism very, very provocative, and it really gets to a way of talking about the co-constitutive nature of race and and disability in a way that I think much of the literature doesn't, that sort of like talks about just like, intersection of race and disability, but really doesn't see them as co-constitutive. So maybe you could talk a bit more about that if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Shelley, for your question. In fact, there is a debate in the philosophy of feminist philosophy of disability regarding the continuity between race it's particular between race and gender in particular, because, for example, there is people like Rosalind Garland Thompson that said there is a continuity between race and disability, and if we understand the inclusion of gender in a reflection, a critical thinking regarding disability, we could extend that to a race. But for me, it's not necessarily, I don't see that in a way that there is sexism, racism, ableism, and we could understood, each one as similar to another, or but I think that there is really, when you are racialized, you are seen in society as disabled, because people will think that you are not capable of, or do something, or think something, or develop a certain area. And it's exactly the same where you are disabled, because your body, your mind is seen as racialized. And I believe there, when I think about a conceptual, a continuity between both, I think racialized body are disabled, and disabled body are racialized in a certain way. I know it's provocative, because people would say, oh no, you cannot, but maybe it's because I am part of them. I don't know, but maybe it's for that. But
Sorry, I was just going to say by provocative, I wasn't implying that, it was contestable or contentious, but rather provocative in the sense of like, very timely and really sort of challenging to sort of the accepted the orthodoxy about how race and disability intersect, much of the literature doesn't even talk about them as co-constitutive or intersecting, but rather sort of like these different oppressions that sort of like, might be combined in one person or something like that, but not sort of in any way that's sort of like structural or material. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Anyone else? Jonathan?
I will come. I couldn't find where to raise my hand. I've been doing this for 5 years or something. I still can't find the raise hand.
It's in the React at the bottom.
Well, okay. Well, here I am anyway. So it's very, very thought-provoking, and it reminds me. So for me, in some ways, these last 2 days have been very depressing, in thinking about how ableist universities are. And Shelley has been pushing me down this line for a long time, and I've been somewhat resisting, but I think my resistance has broken down quite a bit. And particularly issues around the type of performance that's required by academics, and turning up on time, the absolute priority we give to, if the lecture starts at 10 o'clock and you're not there by 5 minutes past 10, that's everyone is going to be talking about that, and colleagues are going to be talking about that. I remember in my own managerial responsibilities, having to discipline lecturer, for not turning up, and at a very short notice, saying she couldn't give a lecture. And this was 20 years ago, or something along those lines, and we didn't have a second thought about it, really. On the one hand, you don't want to blame people if they can't, even if their health stops them from doing something. On the other hand, if you've got 150 people in a room who are waiting for a lecture and no provision has been made, then you're in quite a difficult situation. But of course, it's the structure that has set that up, and we've not given any thought to the ways in which this is discriminatory. So, and I'm not sure I have a question so much as just a set of provoked observations, because one of my PhD students is working on discrimination, and I told her about the first bit of interview training I ever had, which I again used for a long time before I realized how terrible it was. So there was someone from HR, Human Resources in the UK, who's very self-confident, and said, people go through all this interview training, but there are only 3 things you need to know as an interviewer. Can they do the job? Will they do the job? And will they fit in? Okay, so for a long time, that was what was going through my head. And probably there were people I rejected because I thought they wouldn't fit in. And the right thing to do is say, well, if they don't fit in, how can we make them fit in? How can we change things so people can fit in? And I really don't think universities have gone on top of that question. So anyway, these are just thoughts provoked by your very, very interesting talk and set of issues raised. But I don't know if that provokes any response or just say, why did he say those things? But anyway, back to you, Agnès.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan, for your comments. In fact, in the second part of the paper, I discuss the question of performance mindset that we have, and in particular in academia, because now, for me, I am teaching in a specific context where in critical disability study we apply and we try to apply what we call creep time. So there is many students that do not submit their assignment on time or things like that. And we tend to accept that because we know they are going through many challenges in life. But the fact is that the university, and I believe it's the same maybe in the UK or like in Canada, it's really meant by, a mention of performance mindset. You have to produce something. And what you have to, the university led you to produce something, and you have to fit in this performance mindset. So, and it's interesting what you just said regarding the trick question in interview, because when we think about even the word fit in is a word that meant to exclude disabled people, in fact. So when even in the language that we use to give a sense of our context of realities.
Okay, we do have a two-part question from Cecilia Munn in the question and answer. I will read it aloud. Thank you, Agnès, for your presentation on the commitment to EDID and how the lack of appropriate EDID responses are rooted in intersecting problems of ableism and racism. I agree with you on everything you presented, so I hope you forgive me if I ask a question that you alluded to in your presentation but did not discuss. You noted how capitalism might be related to ableism, but I'm wondering if that is the case. It seems to me, especially given the discussions we had yesterday on African cultures of communalism, that communalism grounds ableism to a very significant extent. Furthermore, it seems that from the perspective of social emotional responses, capitalistic conditions might be more amenable to meeting the needs of disabled people rather than more socialistic conditions. For example, as an analogy, I recall my experience at a Canadian airport, how everyone is required to put their own bags on the baggage lift. I found this surprising, but realized that it was a consequence of socialistic efficiency. And the result is that it disadvantages disabled people even more. In the US, because of the capitalistic service approach, there is no expectation that any airplane passenger would put their own bags on baggage belt. I'm thinking the same kind of logic might apply in differences between how disabled students might be accommodated in Canadian versus US institutions of higher education. I'd appreciate you sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Cecilia, for your question. On your comment on the Canadian airport, it's not something I even think about. It will depend. For me, I see that I see capitalism as a huge part in ableism, because when we look at this performance mindset society, the fact that we have to fit in the workplace, I believe it's meant because of this capitalism, and it's the reason why I developed an idea of capitalism. I said that in French. In English, that sounds different. So now I pronounce that.
Time with that word too.
Yes, so maybe I will change. So anyway, yeah, so I believe there is it's really important, but socialism, it depends what we call socialism. If is it a socialism meant by a specific political structure, or if it's socialism that we create by ourselves. For example, the kind of socialism that we can create if we apply community care, which is a principle of disability justice. So yes, if it's this kind of socialism, it could work for disabled people because it's developed by the way in which we envision the world, what means some capacity that we have on some things that we cannot do, but we can rely on someone else to do for us, that for us. So it could be meant by the way in which we envision the world. So how we embrace our wholeness, but if it's something meant by the government structure, I'm afraid that the result could be the same from that capitalism, because even the socialism has a goal, and the goal is a way to organize society and fit the criteria of the society.
I just want to follow up on that question and say that, one, Canada is not a socialist state. Far from it, it's neoliberal. And two, Canada does not have a piece of legislation such as the ADA. So in the States, there's very clear procedures and guidelines and legislation about what's permissible. What are permissible expectations for people in the public sphere. Okay, I want to go to a question from I'm sorry if I mispronounce this. Helena Sareba, who writes, I would like to hear, I presume I would like to hear Dr. Agnès' words about her manifesto for a disability justice in academia. I thank you in advance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in fact, oh yes, I can put about that. I can
that link.
Yes, send the link to my paper.
Do you want to put that in the chat? Agnès?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
Okay, there's another question from Helea, but I think I'll take a question from Naomi Shaman and go back to the second one from Helea. Naomi writes, thank you for this presentation, especially the co-constitution of race and disability. I worry a bit about the all-consuming nature of universities, the idea that every valid way of knowing belongs there. It usually manifests as invidious exclusion, but not all groups of people want to be brought inside universities, especially given the good, I think, norm that what happens there should be open to everyone, not hidden or secret. Should we worry about the omnivorous nature of universities?
It depends what we mean by omnivorous nature of university, but I
think by omnivorous, Naomi means like all-encompassing, comprehensive.
Yes.
Naomi uses the word all-consuming at the top of the comment, so I think that's what they mean.
Yes, in fact, it's Yes, because there is an idea of, and it's something I want to highlight, is that there is an idea of the only way to know is in university, in a specific setting. But in fact, there is, as I said, implicit understanding on people. For example, all the work that has been done by community organizer, in particular people in disability justice setting, but they are producing knowledge as well. So
sorry, I'm sorry for interrupting. I see a comment now at the bottom there from Naomi that I think refers to the term omnivorous. If it's edible, good stuff, we should take it in. I think that's what they mean. Might it not be important to recognize ways of knowing that flourish elsewhere?
Yes, in fact, we tend to recognize, what is products in university, but what is products elsewhere, it's also valuable. And it's also the way in which we did not, because we are in a university setting, we did not recognize alternative way of knowledge, because we saw this way of knowledge as alternative, but we do not value them. So for example, art, what is products in art? I just give an example. I gave art assignment to my students, and I said, we will do that. We will express what is disability, starting from the bottom. It's bottom-up way of products knowledge. We do, for example, intuitive collage to develop a conception of disability rather than taking the text. Of course, we take text also, but it's the way in we have to find a way to recognize alternative way of knowledge and introduce this alternative way of knowledge also in the university setting. And so yes, it's really important to recognize what is the other way of knowledge that flourish elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. I think that we could probably stop there and maybe take a 2 or 3 minute break, come back at say well, my time, it would be about, well, maybe we can come back at half the hour. So 11:30 here, and what is it there? 4:30? Okay, so we'll do that, and we'll come back for Dalrymple-Fraser's presentation. Thanks very much. See you in a few minutes.
In a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we should give applause to Agnès. Thank you for reminding me, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Agnès. That was a very good presentation. I love your paper, and I'm so glad that I'm going to give a link to it in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get underway. So thank you very much for joining us for this session. This is the second paper of the session. So C. Dalrymple is going to give the presentation now, and I would like to introduce them. C. Dalrymple-Fraser is a disabled philosopher of disability and instructor at the University of Toronto. The research focuses on the ethics and epistemology of healthcare, with emphases on disabled, trans, and queer health. Welcome, C. Begin whenever you're ready, please.
Hi, everyone. So I'm C. My pronouns are they, them. I'll start sharing slides in a moment, but I'll start just by visually explaining where I am in this video. So I'm a white, genderqueer, non-binary person with round glasses, facial hair, a collared shirt with little ghosts on them, and I'm sitting in front of some IKEA shelves that were not built to handle the strain that I put them through, but they should last us today. So I am now going to share a slideshow, and I'll say a few things about it once I'm sure it's on the screen. There we go. So my talk for today is called Crumpled Virtue, tentatively. And one thing I'll start by saying is later in this talk, I'm going to briefly use some reclaimed slurs. I know there's some discourse on how and whether they should be used. And so I'm indicating that ahead of time for your use. This presentation itself is a bit of a mess, and intentionally so. I like exploring messy things, and I want to talk through what in some other spaces might be 3 separate projects together. So the first is thinking about strategies of crumpling from material sciences, and that's going to be the last part of today. I'm going to start by talking about resistance to resilience rhetorics, albeit a little briefly. Read that through some Crumpled Virtue in the Zhuangzi, a Taoist text that some people have taken as indicating some positive things about disability, and then circle back to talking in particular about paper crumpling and other kinds of crumpling. This is based on a talk I've given to undergraduates where it was titled How to Have a Breakdown. I've got a slightly different focus here. But I'd like a kind of question-asking approach, wondering what the relationships between material sciences, things that philosophers, bioethicists, other people don't really pay a lot of attention to, might give us resources, maybe structural metaphors, hermeneutical resources, if you prefer that language, to think about questions of resilience and maybe disabled virtue under oppression. So I'm not aiming to give an argument with a clear thesis. I am aiming to kind of increase some of the mess on the table so that we have other resources to think about some of the stuff going on. Behind the scenes, I have some personal investments, and I'll try to keep some biographical details out of it, but on theme with the panel, and if we want to talk in the shared Q&A later, a lot of this does stem from relationships with academia as well. Because I'm talking about material sciences, later I do have some graphs. I'm going to explain them to the best of my ability. I don't expect you to rely on seeing them, but I do have some illustrations to help us process some things that should be perhaps unfamiliar to us. Okay. With that prelude, stepping into things, I'll start by briefly talking about resisting resilience. So resilience has cropped up quite a lot in the last 5 to 6 years, in particular through the ongoing and heightened pandemic in the early 2020s in particular. And it doesn't have really clear operating definitions in the psychological sciences that focus on it. Here's a definition from a meta-analysis that was studying different types of resilience interventions. They say resilience is the functional process in which individuals adjust and respond to challenges and change in an adaptive manner. And this is language that at my own university, Health and Wellness and Accessibility Services loves to use to support students in becoming more resilient to adversity, to strife, and I'm going to encourage us to think about ableist oppression, among other things as well. In this meta-analysis, many of the types of studied interventions included things like, well, what about sleep habits? Are you listening to music? What about medical adherence, that you are following or being compliant with a medical plan, substance use, hormone and emotional regulation, exercise behaviors, cognitive behavioral therapy, pet therapy, learning how to network, and mindfulness meditation? And on some of these slides, there will be a lot of text. I'm reading it all verbatim so that you don't have to. And so what we can see here and some other discourses is there's a lot of focus on individualized responsibility. And granted, there are other areas of resilience studies that do try to focus on more social structures in place, but that's a relatively small part. And so a lot of the emphasis on cultivating what is sometimes called a virtue of resilience is building individual habits in response to forms of adversity or challenges and changing in adaptive response to them. But a lot of this presupposes things like socio-material privileges, about having access to certain resources, wealth, knowledge, and certain kinds of ability or lack of disability. And so things like sleep, medical adherence, substance use, hormone regulation, exercise, etc., are not equitably accessible to many people, and certainly not equitably distributed within populations. We might also be concerned that focusing on individual responses to challenges can be mechanisms of obscuring these inequities and oppressions by putting responsibility on individuals. Now, there's already a lot of discourse and literature around this topic, and so this is, the crux of my brief summary of the issue. But what we have roughly is a tendency to suggest that people should cultivate resilience. And I'm not entirely opposed to that idea in the abstract. I think resilience would be nice in some moments of my life to be able to respond to things that I don't feel capable of. But I am concerned about the ways that it's being pressed as a particular virtue that individuals need to cultivate, without broader attendance to the kinds of social structural harms, the systems of oppression that focusing on individuals tends to obscure. And so in thinking through this in the last few years of my life in particular, I found one text initially helpful. And so I'm going to talk briefly, before I get to talking about material sciences, about the Zhuangzi. So the Zhuangzi is a Taoist text, typically attributed to Zhuangzi, although we think many people wrote it. And one popular part of that text, emerging in some disability discourse in Chinese philosophy, is what we call the use of the useless. Zhuangzi is interested in saying, look, some things that we consider useless have their own uses. And this is part of our need to interrogate the kind of values that we take for granted. And in doing that, he relies often on disabled characters to try to indicate, these kinds of individuals who might not be taken seriously have their own unique uses despite being considered useless. I have some issues with some of this text. I'm going to be selective in how I present it. And again, in the next few slides, I'm going to be reading a selection of the text in translation, and it does use what is considered a reclaimed slur. That's just the next 2 slides. Okay. So in one story in the Zhuangzi, we're told about a person named Crippled Shu. And Shu, we're told, has his navel covering his chin, his shoulders higher than his head, his hair pointing up to the sky, his organs compressed into the top of his body, and his 2 thighs pressed into his ribs. Still, we're told, by sharpening needles and washing clothes, he was able to make a living. And moreover, when the authorities were recruiting a workforce, because of his chronic ailments, no work was assigned to him. When they were distributing the grain to the infirm and disabled, he received 3 large portions and 10 bundles of firewood. And so, it is suggested, if a man with such a deformed body was still able to make a living and complete his term of life, that is, live out his natural course, as some translations say, how much more could a man who has only a deformity of virtue do? Or, in a slightly different translation from Burton Watson, concludes, with a crippled body, he's still able to look after himself and finish out the years heaven gave him. How much better, then, if he had crippled virtue? Now, there's a bunch of things going on behind the scenes. I'll unpack just a few of them on this slide. But I want to start with some objections to the idea that, this might look like a good instance of disability being taken well in the context of this philosophy, and in particular as a response to the kind of maybe ableist backdrop that we might see that Zhuangzi is trying to use, ironically, to say, look, your presumptions about this ability are mistaken. There are things that this person has that we can take for granted. And so one, of course, is this story tells us that he has social and material supports, right? That there are individuals who are supporting him, that there is a workplace that he's able to enter into, that he has access to food that is being distributed, that he's able to live out his years, in part because of the social structures that are a little bit behind the scenes, and his body being focused in isolation of those, again, makes us look maybe a little too much on the individual. Some commenters on Zhuangzi thought about this too. And so in some later chapters that are thought to be written by his followers, there's another story where an individual is greeting Zhuangzi and says, we must prepare a meal. So let's have some goose. And he asks the person working for him, can you go get a goose? And the person says, well, we have 2 geese. One who honks as one ought and one who doesn't. So which one should I butcher? And they say, clearly the goose that wouldn't honk. And so here, then, there's a goose that does not meet the standards of usefulness and who does not live out its years. In fact, there are other uses found for that in some way. And so I want to resist the temptation to read this more openly as a positive example of disability and isolation in the context of the Zhuangzi, which I've sometimes seen on blog posts. But I do think there are some interesting things here. One, it is a temptation, an attempt to resist human-made norms and harms. even if we might value a little more nuance and context. And in particular, the more perhaps literal reading of this is saying it would be good if we had sort of crypt virtues with regard to Confucian virtues that had really focused on following specific rituals, following specific practices. We want to allow for individuals to follow their own paths. And that is an interesting contribution in its own right. But the first time I read this, I was reading the Watson out of context, and I thought, how neat that we're thinking about cripping virtues, about taking critical disability lenses to the idea of things like moral responsibility and participation, that maybe what is good for broad individuals might not be good for certain individuals. What are the virtues of disability itself that we might not just see it as a pejorative negative condition associated with a body that might appear certain ways as described in these kinds of stories? And so in the context of this Taoist text, I was thinking about, when reading it, in terms of my own disabilities, my own experiences in academia. And without biographizing too much, things like progressive rheumatoid arthritis leading my hands to themselves be crumpled or limited in their range of movements, about being on a job market and wondering about disclosures of disability, knowing that they're not going to be accommodated in the ways that these stories are, and thinking in general about the kinds of virtues and norms held up around things like resilience and responding to the circumstances and what alternative virtues and spaces there might be. And again, there's some interesting philosophical work on this, but my mind led instead to thinking about paper. So I'm going to talk for the rest of this time a little more about material sciences and some interesting studies that I think open up other ways of thinking about stuff. And so this comes with it a few graphs. I'm going to explain them, and if they're unclear, do follow up in the Q&A. So here is what looks like a relatively simple graph, and I'm going to explain it in the next few slides. For those who cannot see, it is a graph with two axes. On the bottom, it's time, and on the side axis, it's height. And we see a diagonal line leading from the top left to the bottom right. And what it's indicating is that over time, the height of something has gone down. And that something in particular is a sheet of paper. So I have some crude drawings on the slides, but I'm going to narrate these as well. So what these scientists did is they took a sheet of paper for our purposes, or if you're a nerd, mylar as a standard substitute, and they put it into a cylinder. And then what they did is on top of that piece of paper, they put a weight. And the hope was to see what happens over time if we put a weight on top of a piece of paper in this confined space. Well, the prediction is, and the graph eventually shows, that piece of paper under a weight begins to crumple. And over time, that weight crumples it further and further. And the expectation was eventually at some point it's got to stop. The graph with a diagonal line shows that it doesn't. In fact, over the 3 weeks that they ran the study before they kind of got bored and moved on, the paper continued to crumple and crumple and crumple without increasing the weight at all. Over a period of 3 weeks, it decreased constantly in size, and to date, we don't really have an asymptote or a threshold really well developed in the material sciences. This was interesting to me in thinking about things like resilience, about what does it mean to want to be pushing up against a weight that is there constantly, that is not merely a token example or experience of some challenge that we must overcome. And what does this mean in the context of something like progressive neuropathy or progressive arthritis, and what it might mean to conceptualize resilience to an ongoing struggle, rather than these virtues as they're touted in the psychological sciences that primarily focus on individual adverse events. Okay. That was the first part of their study. They had a few other parts. And one that I'm really interested in is kind of a crumpling under the weight study called a redux, where they introduced a kind of self-care break, we might call it. So what happens if we put, again, a piece of paper in a cylinder and we put a weight on it, and then after a little bit of time, we take the weight off. We give it a little bit of a break. The expectation we might have is, well, a paper ball, when you stop applying weight to it, will start to expand a little bit. And then if you apply the weight, it might start to go down again. What's interesting in this study, and this is one of my favorite graphs in science generally, I'm going to explain it again, is when they removed the weight and then put it back on, they found that the weight dropped to a level where it would have been if the weight was never removed in the first place. So this is a graph very similar to the first one. On the bottom line is time, and on the side is height, and it's a diagonal line with a break in the middle. That break is when they remove the weight for a period of about 500 seconds, and then they put it back on. But the line, if we were to draw with a ruler right through it, it's the same as the first graph. Why this resonates with me in particular is thinking about things like traumatic experiences, thinking about self-care under context of oppression, or in the university, what does it mean to take a mental health break where that breakage in myself is perhaps caused by the academic systems that I'm then returning into and that have not changed? What might these crumpling processes that we see outside of these kinds of lived experiences and discourse offer us? And so some general questions to open up questions are, what constitutes resilience under constant pressure, right? Under the weights of ableism and other oppressions and how they interact. What does it mean to, using the quotes from the definition of resilience, adaptively adjust and respond to a persistent ongoing challenge? And when is that desirable as opposed to addressing that challenge itself? I've hinted that I do think resilience is not always bad, right? That it would be nice at times to be able to press back, but I don't think that's always available, and I don't think that's always desirable. And so my question opening up is, how can thinking about physics of crumpling open up different imaginative spaces? And again, I'm not going to give you an answer, but I'm going to give some examples that I've been thinking about, and just a few for the sake of time. So here's where we talk about thinking about crumpling. So my overall question here is, what might varieties of crumpling tell us about strategies of resistance? And I'll give us just a few to think about as starting points. One is, we can design crumpling in a very particular way. We might think of it as folding. And so one type of folding that is actually known to have a lot of strength is called corrugation. So on this slide, I have two images on the right-hand side. On the top is an accordion folded piece of paper. This is when you fold it in one direction and then fold it back, fold it again. This is how you make a paper fan, for example. And on the bottom, I have a photo of corrugated cardboard, which uses this same technique. When you have an accordion fold or corrugation, you find that paper folded in that way will very easily compress in one direction, but becomes a lot stronger in the other direction. And so one cheap way of making sturdy cardboard is having corrugated layers. They allow flexibility in some directions, but strength in others. And when I think about corrugation under the context of pressure, weight, resilience, that's what am I willing to give up? What things do I want to orient myself towards? How might resilience as a strategy need to be contextualized in terms of our directions and our intents? What are we intending to resist in these contexts? Again, I want to leave these a little loosey-goosey because these are opening up ways of possibly thinking. Another thing that's common in crumpling and in compressing is bulging and buckling, like if you've ever tried to collapse a soda can, for example. On the image on the right side of the screen, I have a stress ball. When you squeeze a stress ball in one direction, it bulges out in another. Or you might think of if you squeeze a balloon and how it bulges outside of the direction you're pressing, perpendicular to the direction of your motion, the physicists might say. And this is interesting in the context of thinking about crumpling and weight under oppression in terms of directionality and how we might press into other spaces. And for paper balls in particular, if we think about buckling and how things fold in on themselves, the physics of this is actually they're storing a lot of energy. If we were in a physical room together, I would throw some balls for those around. A crumpled paper ball is actually really bouncy. It has a lot of energy loaded into it. And so I wonder for myself, what does it mean to crumple under these pressures and ways of storing different kinds of energies and what spaces I might want to enter into? Or connecting this briefly to other philosophical literature, right? What in the context of thinking about crumpling under oppression might that mean for how we store anger or sadness in our joints and our minds and our anger and our activism in connection to more contemporary writers and critics of anger like Maisha Cherry or Maria Lugones. A little more on the technical side here is what we might call auxetic materials or auxetic metamaterials. Auxetic just means that it does the opposite of that bulging and buckling phenomenon. So an example I have on the right side of the screen is what's called a Hoberman sphere, or you might see them sold on Walmart, Amazon, wherever as breathing balls or expanding balls. And if you have my video on the screen, I also have an example from a dollar store in front of me. And these kinds of materials, when you pull them in one direction, instead of collapsing perpendicularly, they expand out. And when I push in one direction, they collapse in all directions. And this is surprisingly an interesting point of strength. One, of thinking about how collapsing, condensing, and pulling away from or crumpling under weights might be a way of passing or masking or fitting into spaces, but also a particular source of strength. So another nerdy example is what we might call limpet teeth. Limpets are a kind of mollusk. Think of them basically as snails. They live on rocks and they feed on algae on rocks. And so they need some pretty strong teeth to scrape away. And about 10 years ago, a really big point of interest was they outpaced spider silk as the strongest material. So on the right-hand side of the screen, I have two images. On the top is just a photo of these mollusks. They're just small little mollusks called limpets. And on the bottom right is a close-up scan of their teeth. Mollusk teeth are, for limpets, are smaller than a human hair, but they're made up of little fibers arranged in a way that if you press in any direction on them, the tooth will strengthen in that direction. It will push back because it crumples all around that point of contact. This allows the teeth to scrape along rocks because it becomes stronger at that point of impact. And similar technology is being used in things like bulletproof vests, in glass, in thinking about crumple zones on cars to protect people, about how crumpling can actually be a site of resistance or resilience in the sense of becoming maybe a little more compacted and stronger in response. And so how might crumpling, which is usually seen as a failure, as an undesirable virtue, nonetheless be something possibly positive? And of course, there's also the question of why don't we break out of that cylinder? Right? What does it mean to actually challenge that weight rather than thinking about crumpling on its own as an individual thing, of resilience as an individual strategy, ignoring that social context? I think it's important to look further. Nonetheless, I think crumpling can be an interesting path into thinking further. And so to wrap up with some other possible directions, just for any possible nerds, some other things that we can do that I'm not doing in this presentation for time, but think about things like, well, topographical research, that is studying the layout of crumples and folds. We have a lot of science that tells us we don't know how paper crumples well. We can't predict how things are going to crease. And in fact, if you put the same paper ball under a weight multiple times and you pull it out and you put it back in, it's going to develop new creases. It doesn't always fold in the same predictable way. And what might this tell us in many ways about our own responses over time, about individuation, about how we think about different strategies of buckling, energy, etc.? Also, origami science, I think, is really interesting, and it's surprising to me that origami as a philosophy doesn't show up often in philosophy generally. In particular, some famous origami out of the context of Japan include the Miura-ori fold. If people want the nerdy details, I'll give them to you later. But this fold is considered auxetic and was used to develop satellite arrays to make sure that solar arrays, when they unfold from a satellite, do so predictably, because when you push in one direction, we expand in all directions. And when you pull them back in, they collapse in all directions. With 3D printing, people are a lot more interested in auxetic locking. How do we design different kinds of materials that can hold very particular shapes, that can expand in certain directions and collapse in others? And what does this mean for me considering my own responses to these sources of oppression, resistance, weight, etc.? And what things I want to hold on to or let go? What kinds of preparation I can do for crumpling? What thresholds there are for tearing, of course. If you fold a piece of paper back and forth, it becomes more prone to breakage and to tearing. And so at what point does folding and crumpling lead to damage and shouldn't just be considered virtuous? What might this tell us? And also, expanding even more broadly, so crumpling and folding might be related to strategies of tucking and folding in trans and queer crip bodies and spaces. How do we pass by tucking away physically or verbally or other kinds of displays, parts of ourselves for navigating different kinds of institutions that press on those points? And what kinds of adaptive crumpling might we do? So again, this is meant to be a bit of a mess. And in doing that mess, what I want to do is think about kind of strategies that we haven't really been considering in philosophy and whether or not they might help, either as structural metaphors for interrogating the kinds of presumptions that we have, how these other resources from different disciplines might inform our current discourses on what it means to engage with burdened virtues or virtues that might seem to only be valuable under context of oppression, and how this might engage with different kinds of philosophy. And so in the same way that a crumpled paper ball is a little messy, so is this presentation, and I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. See, that was, as I said in the chat, both fascinating and entertaining. So if everyone wants to show their gratitude to C before we start a question and answer. I have 3 remarks from Melinda. One is a clarification about a word, but I'm going to start with the first. It says, might I ask if you have consulted Maria Lugonis's concept of curdling? I think it's so in line with your crumpling project and that you would really enjoy it. She rejects what she theorizes as the logic of separation from the perspective of a mestiza scholar person, and that she wants to curdle like dairy milk, which refuses to be strained, or like a sour cream or egg mixture, which is a rebellious move. She writes this over into her critique of empire and the correct word, racialized hierarchies. So do you want to respond to that, C?
Yeah, so I have that book right here. For people unfamiliar, it's Pilgrimages and Peregrinages. And in a different, longer version of this talk, I was absolutely going to quote. I actually have some bonus slides at the end of every slideshow, just in case I talk too quickly. And she features there. My point of contact wasn't actually going to be curdling. And I think that's really interesting, and I want to look into that further. I'm interested in general on how she thinks about things like agency, doesn't use this term, under oppression, and what it means that dominant norms and values, and including social material context, constrain the kinds of possibilities that are legible. And so outside of that context, I was interested in borrowing from her and also scholars like J. Logan Smilges in their book on crypt negativity for thinking about how the kinds of values that we associate with different forms of resistance or resilience might not be legible in the ways that are currently desirable, and what other possibilities there are. And so Smilges, taking this as a piggyback point, is interested in particular on, what would it mean to have like a life strike? To be able to give up and, I think they say, hibernate like a bear, and how desirable that could be for certain disabled and queer and trans people to retire and retreat from these kinds of pressures instead of having to stand up against them. I think there's some really cool connections between Lugonis and some others like Smilges as well. So thank you for bringing that up, because I would have loved to in the presentation, and this is our chance to now.
Okay, great. Jonathan has his hand up. So Jonathan, please.
Thank you so much. So such a fascinating talk, and I hadn't come across any of the material science, so it was very amusing and as you predicted, a surprising set of graphs there. But I wonder what the consequences are for the concept of resilience more broadly. So, it's something you see almost everywhere now, that we have this sort of mollycoddle generation. They never got the skills of resilience. They can be trained to become more resilient. I mean, is your thought that this is never appropriate, or just not appropriate in some contexts? So, sorry if you covered it. You covered a lot of things, but I didn't pick up your answer to that.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I did try to avoid giving answers because I wanted to do a different type of talk. So my inclination is to think that resilience is not always inappropriate. I think the word always rarely works out for us, and same with never. I think that it can be valuable for us to be able to survive academia, for me to, hide or disclose things as a strategy of thinking about how I want to navigate a job market, for different approaches to resilience as mindfulness to open up different paths that people can consider choosing. What I don't like is the presupposition that this is necessarily a positive thing that people need to be engaging with, and that this is the first line response that individuals should have to different kinds of adverse experiences, oppression, etc., that we should hold out on hope for better futures and admit of medical assistance dying in the ways that things are, without also attending to the more larger structural changes. So I've been grappling with, and I do not have answers for, the question of when strategies of like harm reduction become complicity in structures of oppression and harm, and how at the same time, we just need to survive. And so I think there's places for resilience. I am opposed to the overgeneralizing habit of thinking of this as a necessarily positive thing, and that it harms individuals who are, expected morally and not just socially to be doing this kind of work for themselves when they don't always have the social and equitable resources, and that it puts a lot of responsibility on us. And. So it's a kind of yes and answer. I do think it can be appropriate. I don't think it should be our sole focus, and I'm concerned about the ways that it obscures other things.
Okay, so let me raise an example that affects everyone in academia at some point, which is the peer review system. So you send in your papers, and we're still in a position where peer reviewers, on the whole, I don't know whether they take pleasure in being a bit unpleasant, but sometimes they certainly give the appearance that they do. That they're probably peer reviews don't much enjoy peer reviewing. Think of it as their duty and take it out a bit on the authors. And so, so I personally, not that the matters find this so upsetting that I don't do it anymore. So I don't submit for peer review. And I'm luckily in a position where pretty much everything I write has got its venue for publication before I start writing it. So I don't have to worry. But yeah, sometimes I feel that's rather pathetic, and someone in my position should not be defeated when I get a snotty peer review. And of course, for my graduate students, they're not in that position, so they have to accept the system. I sort of encourage a type of resilience. But on your analysis, would that be harmful for people to do that type of what it would be a type of selective attention, what you listen to and what you don't listen to and how you take it?
Yeah, that's tough, and that's something that I'm dealing with personally. If it's been a little too opaque, I'm on the job market, and I know many people who are. And these kinds of pressures also in teaching-oriented jobs, thinking with course evaluations from students, can also show quite a breadth of responses. And so in reviewing them and making an application recently, just the struggle of working through any of those. And I understand that many people who, with their relative privilege, no longer read them sometimes. In these contexts, my advice would be that it's got to be assessed on an individual basis. I know for myself, there are many conferences I do not apply to if I do not expect that kind of comfort and response. And sometimes that's harmful to me. And it might have been better on an analysis of academic better professionally to pursue opportunities that I've chosen not to, where I've curdled or crumpled myself away from those kinds of spaces. At the same time, I'm aware that I kind of need to engage in those spaces, and so some modicum of what we might call resilience would be appropriate. Of course, the more appropriate or the longer goal thing is to address those kinds of things, to make sure that those, peer reviews are filtered by editors appropriately, that they're not sent directly, that we change that whole system entirely. But my simple answer is it's got to be on the ground and it's got to be individually determined, but we have to attend to the structural stuff. That's the cherry.
Thank you. So I have a question in the chat from Jane and a question in the Q&A from August. I'm going to take the question in the chat from Jane first because that's the one I saw first. So Jane writes, enjoyed the glorious nerdiness of the example C. Thank you. Have you looked at Arceli Dakamuchi's work on activist affordances, including book of that name? I thought of some of the moves she makes in integrating performance theory into thinking of how disabled people navigate the world, as well as her discussion of shrinkage as you were speaking.
Good. So the short answer is I haven't read that yet, but I've heard of it secondhand, and it's definitely something that's on my list. And so I'd be very happy to have a digital coffee with anyone who wants to talk about that more. It's on my reading list, and so I don't feel qualified to speak to it further, but I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, let's move on to the question from August. C, thank you for a talk that made my brain very happy by giving me access to an area of conceptual space I never knew about and never would have been able to access by trying to look at graphs or images on my own without your verbal descriptions. My question is just an invitation to add a little narrative to an example or two of what crumpling could look like in practice as a form of resistance / resilience / response.
Yeah. So I think I kind of indicated some in responding to these other questions. In, for example, these job market cases or journal cases of making strategic choices to withdraw or give up. But other examples are perhaps the familiar kind of beyond the scope of this paper problem. I recently completed my PhD finally, and that involved me choosing to crumple up a lot of paper and leave it out for the purposes of getting things done, rather than exploring the things that I think are necessarily valuable. There are ways in which I still love parts of that dissertation and also parts in which I disavow it. And I think that within these kind of academic practices, sometimes there are ways in which we withdraw away as a mechanism of survival, a strategy of survival, in ways that not showing up can be important, in ways in which giving in to recommendations as a means, you disagree with reviewer 2, and nonetheless you make an accommodation because you're not going to get hired if you don't have publications. I think these are small examples of crumpling in ways that allow for energy to be spent elsewhere, for the potential of other opportunities, and which might be considered forms of resilience if we broaden that scope. And I think there's another question in the Q&A that will address that more directly in a moment. But in the shrinkage form of crumpling, I think being willing to give up and theorizing and deciding when to give up and when to break down in general is a relatively common choice for many people. And so those examples would be the starting examples for the sake of time.
Okay, thank you. I'll take the question from Cecilia Munn. Thank you, C, for your very inspiring presentation on how the material sciences can be used to help us think about disability. To push a bit further on Jonathan's question about resilience, but in a different direction, I'm wondering if maybe one can interpret your suggestions, and more so suggesting different ways of conceiving resilience rather than as ways of providing an alternative to the notion of resilience. For example, each of your examples include characteristics of vulnerability and strength, and I think at its core, that's the point of resilience.
Yes, I think that's a fair characterization, right? So at its core, what I want to do is interrogate some of the existing norms around resilience, but that also includes whether and how we appreciate it and what scope we want to give it. And in that context, I don't think resilience is necessarily bad. I don't think it's necessarily good. And I also don't think that we're necessarily conceptualizing it right if we're focusing on individual, resilience in the absence of other considerations. And my hope is that thinking about crumpling as a more complex phenomenon than we tend to think about when we toss away a piece of paper also gives us access to other ways of thinking about kinds of resilience. And so the resilience that, might be a point of strength in pushing back or in closing oneself off and becoming stronger in the way that a limpet tooth is maybe a way of interrogating the kinds of taken for granted norms that resilience is a pushing back or a springing back from adversity that returns us towards some kind of normal, what it might be to think about the creases that stay in pieces of paper on ourselves, the energy that we're expending, etc. Short answer, yes, I think it's fair to interpret these suggestions as ways of conceptualizing resilience differently, and maybe using these metaphors as ways of exploring the other kind of possibilities there, rather than just saying the existing form of resilience is yes or no good in these particular ways. What else we could mean by that? That's kind of what I do want to hope by putting some of these options on the table. So thanks for giving me the chance to express that more concisely.
Okay, great answer. Mitch Curia asked this question. Neoliberal elites tend to define resilience as an individual capacity, which allows them to blame individuals for failing to survive neoliberal conditions. Interestingly, research on resilience surged throughout the 90s when governments were destroying the welfare state. Do you think we should reframe resilience as a relational/collective property, or is there room for individual resilience?
Both is my short answer. I'm seeing if I can find a really lovely quote from J. Logan Smilges, but I don't think I can just on the spot. I will say yes. So my concern is, focusing on individual capacities is a way of obscuring the relational things that some of our other presenters have pointed out, that we are individuals in context, legible as individuals or agents in specific contexts, and that is going to inform how we think about things like resilience as possibly individual properties, and the need to push further beyond those binaries to think otherwise. And so Maria Lugonis, as was suggested earlier, I think is a really valuable source for thinking about these kinds of things. As for whether we should reframe resilience as a relational or collective property, or if there's room for individual resilience, I think both. I think adjectivalizing things, right? Qualifying them specifically allows us for a little more nuance that is often appropriate, so that we can talk about individual resilience as individual resilience, instead of talking about resilience as if that were the only type. And that collective resilience or relational accounts of resilience, close to disability justice, right, to crip access intimacy, to the kinds of relational community building approaches to things like self-care, to resilience that have been interrogated, especially in the last 10 years in disability literature, are important sites for expanding what is the current focus. I indicated briefly on when I was giving that definition of resilience that there is some work in resilience sciences to attend to the socioeconomic and material conditions that affect these kinds of things, that if we want someone to be more educated about psychological well-being or cognitive behavioral therapy, that presupposes a lot of things aside from that being helpful for them. So the answer is both. I think getting specific with what we're trying to target when it comes to resilience, while also trying to expand it to be a little more messy, are important strategies of pushing back against these neoliberal overgeneralizing tendencies to take this as a standalone virtue that is a monad in need of no further interrogation and taken for granted, and chop it up and make it a little more messy. So yes, both.
So there's a question from Naomi Shaman in the Q&A and a question from Agnès in the chat. So what I'm going to suggest is that we do this. We take the question from Naomi, and that following your response, Agnès comes back on screen, asks her question, and we move into after your response, we move into sort of a group discussion for a little bit, and we end up a bit early. How does that sound? Okay, great. So Naomi asks, is there something in the material science of crumpling that gets at the ways in which resilience can consist in / lead to pushing back against the force that led to the crumpling, not just springing back, but actively attacking?
Yeah, so this area I'm not as familiar with, but I'll give a general gloss, and it's something definitely for looking further, right? Definitely. So in the context of something like paper crumpling, the fact of crumpling, of aligning those creases, is a form of energy storage. And that's why, for example, a paper ball is relatively bouncy. Hopefully, at least somebody in the audience has tried to bounce a paper ball since mentioning that. In the context of something like the cylinder example that I gave the graphs for earlier, the leading hypothesis was it's got to stop at some point because we're pushing back. And it was surprising to them to see that that was not yet the case. We might find that further over time. But the way that people have pushed on this more so are in what I've glossed as auxetic materials. And this is particularly being pushed because there's so much availability of 3D printing right now to find different ways of structuring things that can press back, that can lock into particular shapes that resist the kinds of oppression, the kinds of pressures put on them, not just springing back after the fact, but pushing back against these kinds of resistance. So the example of a limpet tooth being used in things like bulletproof vests are ways of resisting points of impact by crumpling around them. But there are also the pushing back on something like a weight experiment. I'm a little less up to date on that science just because that moves a lot faster than the crumpling science. But short answer, yeah, there is some work in that direction, especially for other kinds of materials as well.
Okay, great. So, Agnès, do you want to come on and ask your question? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, thank you so much, C, for your great presentation, a nerdy presentation. So for me who are not familiar in philosophy of science, it's really great to have this perspective. I was thinking about the question of crumpling as more maybe not necessarily that highlight only the question of resilience, but also something that we could see as a dialectic process. So it could be a form of resilience, and also it could be also a form of disability masking. So, and I believe there is a dialectic there, in fact. And I don't know if you could maybe develop two ideas of crumpling of, because, for example, neurodivergent people, they are crumpling every time. So as a form of resilience, sometimes as a form of protection. So yes, it's just my question.
Yeah, so I think the possible shortest response to this, even though I'm going to ramble it out as I think out loud, because I think this is a great question, is there are many things that crumpling can do. And if we think of it also in terms of things like folding or tucking away, of different kinds of manufacturing, the ways that we shrink or appear, some literature I like out of trans studies and trans philosophy in the past 5 years has also been pushing in this kind of masking as or passing as also forms of resistance sometimes, about refusing to answer questions and letting people make assumptions as a better tactic than trying to explain things away, the epistemic exploitation involved in there, or appropriation, to use some of the more epistemic injustice and oppression literature. I think there are ways in which crumpling is not just a form of resilience, but can be a way of masking and passing, and in that way can serve different aims. So one of the things about crumpling is I think directionality matters, and corrugation, for example, and we can pay attention to what we attune to. And so in the broader like structural and then local harm things, I think something is still resistance if it doesn't suddenly cure ableism or racism and it doesn't meet those big goals. Sometimes what I'm trying to resist is just like the labor of explaining stuff to someone, or of being, on the table as disabled. I have a folding cane, and that's because I don't need my cane all the time, but it's also so I can whip it out when I need a seat on the transit system and tuck it away when I feel like I'm not in a safe space. And those can be different parts of a broader dialectic of how we do appear, how we withhold, how we, crumple and unfold. I think there's a lot to explore there. Absolutely.
Okay. See, I'm going to allow you to, I'm going to give you the option of asking Agnès a question, since she just asked you a question. But there's also a comment / question in the Q&A from Cecilia Munn. So do you want to take a look at that? For C to consider, I'm in thinking about your response to Mitch's question. I'm wondering if your crumpling examples from the material sciences can help exemplify a more relational notion of resilience. So perhaps there might be some tension here between your aim to also accommodate a relational understanding of resilience. Do you want to respond to that?
I need about 5 seconds to think about it, if people are okay waiting for a few seconds, just so I can make sure I understand the tension appropriately.
No worries.
I don't think I have an answer yet. In part because
Okay.
I'd like to understand that tension more. If you're willing to explain it, I'd be happy to figure it out together.
Do you want to? Okay, we can come back
I
to that.
understand.
There's something from August here. Just sorry, did you want to say
Sorry to
something?
interrupt, Shelley. There's a clarification that's very helpful.
Okay.
So all the examples that were provided seem to be more individualistic. Cecilia adds to the commentary. Great. So if I wanted to go further into the material science, I would lead into what we call metamaterials, which are constructions that involve a lot of parts. So the example of this sphere is one where there are a lot more individual parts moving together that facilitate the crumpling mechanisms. And so it is true that a lot of my examples were a little more individualistic. And I also think there are resources for us to think a little more relationally about them as well. And also including, as physicists, want to do outside the ideal context, the context of the experiments, which affect a lot of these variables that we tend to exclude. There is a lot more to unpack, and I appreciate you pointing out the individuality of some of these examples, and I am going to think about that more. Thank you.
Okay, there's something here from August. This question builds on Agnes's. I'm wondering what you think about disclosure / non-disclosure of the choice to crumple at least to other disabled people strategically. Do we need disclosure in order to grow solidarity around crumpling?
Good. I would take this as an invitation for maybe both Agnès and I to respond as well, so that we are.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Monopolizing my time here. I will say I do think it's important to think about, for us, whoever us is to you when I use that word, what our choices to disclose or not to disclose do within communities and outside of those communities. I don't necessarily think we need disclosure to grow solidarity around crumpling, but I think that requires us talking a little more about some of the semiotics and the complex epistemology about things like absences and what we do or do not communicate. But my short is similar to the comments earlier I had about always and never. I think sometimes disclosure is helpful. I don't think it should always be necessary to grow that solidarity. I think there could be other paths, but I don't know if Agnès, if you have other thoughts on this, because it touches in your areas as well.
Yes, thank you so much, C, for this opportunity. In fact, I agree with you. In fact, I believe disclosure is a matter of personal choice, but technically, if we live in a disability justice society, we don't have to disclose anything because everything should be in place. So, and even for accommodation in university, when students come and ask for an accommodation, why ask them to disclose the reason and justify? Because technically, if we use the principle of disability justice, we don't have to. So it should be a natural process, I believe.
Did you want to follow up, C, or does anyone else have anything else that they want to add or another question? Okay, well, maybe we have come to the end of this session. Let's everyone thank our speakers, C and Agnès. Terrific session. I'm very happy to have chaired it. And we can close, and we hope to, Jonathan and I and Jamie hope to see you again tomorrow for some fascinating talks. Do you want to say something, Jonathan?
So I'm not sure I have anything to add other than to thank Shelley for chairing the session and everyone for participating today. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you tomorrow, those who can make it.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And especially thank you for always supporting junior and early career disabled scholars in these conferences. I appreciate the work you're all doing with this conference. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow.